Where we stopped last time, we're going to keep going. We got a lot to cover today, and it's going to lead into the last lecture next Monday on crime trend. So we are going over the findings now from Balmer on all the theories we went through on the two parts, right? And we stopped here last time, and I said that you have to know that in terms of the post-1980s increase in crime, right, 1985 to 1993, the primary explanation is crack. In Balmer's study, which you're supposed to read, he says it could account for up to 40% of the spike in crime, depending on the offense type, up to 40%. You have to remember that. And it's going to get confusing because the factors that led to an increase in crime are not always the factors that lead to a decrease in crime. There's some asymmetry. They differ. Now, although you have to know this, crack market activity is the primary explanation for the spike in crime in the mid-1980s. It can account for up to 40%, depending on the crime type. You don't have to know this, and that is that Balmer found that some other factors mattered, but they mattered less. They played a smaller role. There was a decline in cohabitation, an increase in cohabitation, and a increase in lag teen births. You don't have to know that. It played a small role. It accounted for a much smaller percent. The main thing in the 1980s that led to an increase in crime was the development of crack cocaine and the subsequent expansion of crack cocaine markets, according not only to Balmer but to other studies that have looked at it. Right? Balmer is just the most comprehensive because it covers the theory and it gives you the data and it does something else. Now, here's a survey that I gave you Albany students in this class a couple years ago. And the question here was at the top, of the following factors, which has the largest impact on crime trends in the United States? I did this many semesters, and I stopped doing it because the findings were always the same, right? There was almost no change in any of the distribution, and so it became redundant. They could select any of these: the age distribution of the U.S. population, the number of police, the state of the economy, illegal immigration, or the imprisonment rate. As you can see, you Albany students overwhelmingly thought that it was the economy that drove crime trends. Now, at least in the case of the increase in crime in the 1980s, that's not right. But it is right when it comes to the drop in crime. When I asked police officers or criminal justice professionals and a national sample of 1,000 members of the public, which of the following, how big of a role did these things play in causing crime trends? This is perceptions of the factors that influence crime trends. Both criminal justice professionals like police officers and the general public also agree that the economy matters a great deal. That also is the big one. By contrast, neither criminal justice professionals nor the general public really think that the imprisonment rate, how many people you lock up because of incapacitation, matters a whole lot. That's one of the least endorsed for both samples. And among you Albany students, almost nobody chose it, 14.7%. Now, when you turn to abortion, or as it's sometimes called, the decline in lag births to teenage mothers, lag means in the past. So if I say lag something, that means like 15, 20 years ago. So lag births to teenage mothers would be people born to teenage mothers 15, 20 years ago who would be youth now, right? Police officers, judges, prosecutors, 67% of them think it played a large role, or a very large role. They think that births to teenage mothers matter a lot. By contrast, members of the public, the dark green bar, don't think it matters much at all. And although I'm not going to highlight it in one of these colored boxes, if you look all the way on this side, how does the number of police on the street matter? Police officers like, it matters a lot, right? You have to hire people like me. And the public thinks it matters less. So what we're going to see, short answer is the red, the green, lot, even though not always do people think. So this is supposed to come in one at a time. I just fixed it today, and I don't know why it's not doing it. Interesting. I'm going to try the other PowerPoint. Okay. Literally, before I came to class today, I tried to fix when these things came in, so they would come in differently. And I guess when I saved it, it deleted it. So here are the findings for the 1990s crime drop. Balmer's findings for what things mattered or didn't matter in the crime drop beginning in the early 1990s, about 1993, 1994 onward. And I've highlighted three big ones that you have to know. And we're going to briefly talk about the other big ones, and I'm going to give you some statistics which are actually in this table. And this table, table 5.4, is in the Balmer reading. You can find it. You're supposed to read it and find it for yourself. And this table is largely why I assigned the Balmer reading, because not only does it review the theory, it gives you this table where they compare Balmer's findings to findings in two other major studies about the crime drop. All right. So the first factor that Balmer found played a big role in crime going down beginning in the 90s was increased incarceration. In Balmer's study, increases in incarceration could account for somewhere between 10 and 35% of the drop in crime, depending on crime type. So up to 35%, up to a third, a little over a third of the crime drop could be accounted for by increased incarceration. Locking people up. According to Balmer, the first major factor for the crime drop was incarceration. You got to know that on the test. You got to know all three of the ones in yellow. Now, what's cool about this Balmer study is that you can see his data, but then he compares his findings to the findings in Zimring 2006, which is a major study by Frank Zimring, and Levitt, that's Stephen Levitt, Freakonomics, Abortion Dividend Thesis, 2004. On the left, you have in each of these studies factors that probably mattered a lot, quite a bit. And on the right, you have factors that probably did not matter much. So each of these studies analyzed data and decided which factors played a large role in the decline in crime, and they put them on the left. So Balmer says incarceration matters. So does Zimring, and so does Levitt. All three of them. In fact, among people who study crime trends, one of the strongest consensuses is that increased incarceration played a substantial role in dropping the crime rate. Most estimates are around 30%. Balmer said it could be as much as 35%. Now, inevitably, in most of these classes I've had, when I've said this, someone comes up at the end of class and they argue that mass incarceration doesn't affect crime rates, or they heard it in another class and all that. Let me be clear. Although it appears that incarceration reduces crime, that doesn't mean it's the best way. It doesn't mean it's the most just way, nor does it mean it's the most cost-effective way. There clearly are ways to reduce crime that are more cost-effective and more racially just. The question is not, should we mass incarcerate? The question is just, did it reduce crime? And according to the data, the answer is absolutely. Quite a bit, about 30% or more. 30, 35%, depending on which study you look at. Is it racially biased? Absolutely. Is it very expensive? Absolutely. Are there better ways to reduce crime? Yes. Did it reduce crime? Yes. Right, period. Okay. Now, in Balmer's study, the next major factor was improving economic conditions. In the 1990s, 30% of the drop in crime. Now, unlike in the case of incarceration, the consensus around the role of the economy is strong, but not as strong. It's not nearly universal. So Zimring also thinks that improving economic conditions were one of the factors that mattered a lot. Levitt doesn't. Levitt doesn't list it. So 2 of the 3. But in Ballmer's data, which is the data that I'm assigning for the test and the one that I'm putting the most faith in, it explains up to 30%. It's one of the 2 big 3. You'll notice together the big 3 explain over 90% of the drop in crime, which is why they're highlighted. Up to 30%. That brings us to the third big 3. The abortion dividend thesis, which has been recharacterized as lag teen births. Births in the past to teenage mothers. The other big 3, lag births to teenage mothers. Births to teenage mothers approximately 15, 20 years ago, Ballmer finds it played a huge role, up to 35%, as important as incarceration. That the legalization of abortion, by selectively reducing cohorts that would have been especially at risk of committing crime, explains up to 35% of why crime began going down in the 1990s and kept going down, according to Ballmer. Zimring disagrees. Levitt, obviously, as he's one of the authors of the abortion dividend thesis, believes that it's true. So here you have 2 of the 3 big studies saying that the abortion dividend thesis, or the change in births to teenage mothers, was a major driver of the 1990s crime rate. When you get beyond those big 3, you get some other things that mattered somewhat. Demographic changes, the aging population. As the United States population, the average age is getting older. The size of the police force, and then something that didn't matter at all. In fact, in Ballmer's study, it explains less than 1-2% of the crime drop. Crack. That's what's going to trip you up. So Ballmer finds that police force size explains 3 to 7%. The larger police forces, a really small effect. Demographic changes, the older cohort, 4 to 8%. But this last one here, crack market activity, it's over here in this column, factors that did not matter much. Ballmer finds that the shrinking crack cocaine market explains at most 1 to 2% of the drop in crime. At most. It didn't matter. And if we go back a slide, the economy didn't matter here. And this is what's tricky. And it's on the test, and you need to remember this. For the increase in crime, it was crack, and not really the economy. It played almost no role. By contrast, for the decline in crime, it was the economy, incarceration, and the abortion dividend thesis, and crack did not matter much. You have to know that. That's where people get tripped up on the test. For the crime drop, there are 3 big factors that explain together as much as 90% of the drop. For the crime increase, there was one big factor, according to the data. It explains up to 40%. And most of the other stuff is largely unexplained for the crime increase. All right, y'all got that, right? Okay, I'm trying, literally, I do want Eric, love it. If everybody got an A in class, I'd be so happy I got my ice cream. Not for y'all, for me, I don't have any money. But, I want you to know this. I'm not trying to trick you, I'm literally telling you. On the test, you have to know immigration, which we covered, explains 6% of the drop. You got to know these 3 are the big factors for the drop, and the crack cocaine is a big factor for the increase. You got to know that. Crime went up in the mid-80s, and it started going down in the 90s, and it's been going down consistently since. Now, UAlbany, if you don't know it, UAlbany historically, like I said, just a normal university, right? And he sat in on his lecture, and after this, when I go where I'm about to go, he said, Justin did good. He covered what's right, but then he went down and covered some fringe stuff. So, we're going to cover some fringe stuff now. This is mainstream criminology. This is, right, what ChatGPT would probably tell you. I didn't check. And what the major scholars on crime trends say. There are other theories that say that criminologists and economists don't know what they're talking about, and that this is not what happened. One of the major theories is this: lead. Fringe theory number one. Now, as you're going to see, I won't cover fringe stuff if there's not some convincing data that suggests that it should at least be considered. And every time I cover anything, unlike a lot of classes probably, I'm going to hit you with as much of the evidence as I can find, right? Because I want to make sure I'm not wasting your time. It's like the thing I don't want to do. So, what we know is about lead exposure. We know how people are exposed to lead, right? Lead's not good for you, by the way. I'm going to tell you that. You don't want to be exposed to lead. But we know how people get exposed. It can happen in drinking water, but there's two primary ways that people have been exposed to lead: paint and gasoline. And those two primary ways have varied over time. Looks like this. So these are trends in exposure, history of lead usage in paints and gasoline during most of the 20th century. The green line is paint, the blue line is gasoline, and there's a little dotted line which is total there, right? This is overall use of lead in paint and gasoline. Now the problem with lead in paint is that people can eat the paint. Now you probably wouldn't. You're not going, well, we're going to have lunch today. Paint. But kids do, because it tastes sweet. More often, it becomes dust in a house, and when babies crawl around, they get it on their hands and in their mouth, right? When I moved up here, somebody I know got their house tested for lead. You know what? Took the baby to the doctor, and the baby had all sorts of lead in their blood. And come to find out, the steps in front of the house had been painted with gray paint back in the day. They had lead paint on them, and people were walking in the wood steps to the house. They were getting dust, lead paint dust on their shoes, and walking into the living room. That's how it was getting in, right? So in the past, people would eat lead paint, or it would become dust in the house and get in people's hands and get in babies' mouth, right? That gave way because, for the most part, they stopped using lead paint. And then the older houses that had it, they got rid of it or covered it up, etc. By the mid-1900s, the primary way that people got exposed to lead was gasoline. They didn't drink it, obviously. If you drink gasoline, it will kill you. But when people burn lead gasoline, what comes out of the back of the car? Exhaust. It creates ambient lead in the air. Ambient air lead, which then settles in the dirt around roads, particularly in urban areas, and kids get it that way. So these are the two things. What we know is that the average level of lead in children's blood, children here we mean age 6 and under, the average amount of lead in children's blood, kids age 6 and under, dropped by 75% between 1976 and 1991. The average amount of lead in children's blood under age 6 dropped by 75% between 1976 and 1991. If you just look up here, you see the blue drop. Behind the blue, though, is that dot, the black dot line, right, which you can see over here. You can just see from the 1970s to the 1990s, lead just dropped, it just disappeared for the most part. There was a huge drop in exposure to lead among children. It's part of the story. losses in intelligence. When children are exposed to lead, especially before the age of 3, it leads to permanent cognitive damage, permanent losses in IQ. They forever are less smart. It impairs formative brain development and hurts cognitive abilities. Let me show you what this looks like. This is a huge study. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. Okay? Each of these graphs shows a different outcome. The outcomes are highlighted in yellow. What is on the x-axis? The x-axis, for those of you who don't remember from math classes, is the bottom of the graph. What's on the x-axis is the early childhood lead exposure. That is, how much exposure this person had as a child to lead. On the top graph, you see the probability, that P with parentheses, the probability of high school graduation juxtaposed against how much lead you were exposed to. The bottom graph shows you your high school grade point average juxtaposed against how much lead you were exposed to as a kid. Not in high school, but when you were 1, 2, 3 years old. The more lead you were exposed to, the worse you did in high school. Now, this is foreshadowing where we're going to go. This is the same thing, probability against lead exposure, but here what we're looking at, the outcome, the y-axis, is the probability of any criminal conviction in adulthood and late adolescence, 15 to 24. People who were exposed to more lead when they were 1, 2, 3 years old were more likely to have a criminal conviction when they were between the ages of 15 and 24. A decade later. Alright, now we haven't got there yet, but combine these things in your head. The lead exposure changed dramatically. Between the 1970s and 1990s, the average amount of exposure to lead among children dropped 75%. We know that lead messes up your brain. It leads to a loss in IQ, you do worse in school, and you're more likely to be convicted on a crime. On your own, without being scientists, you can put those puzzle pieces together and anticipate the story that's coming. Now, this is IQ and crime. This is how IQ predicts the probability of being arrested, incarcerated, or incarcerated if you get arrested, which is a measure of how severe the crime was you committed on average, right? The higher the IQ, the lower the contact with the criminal justice system, according to data. So on the x-axis, you got IQ scores. On the y-axis, you got the predicted probabilities of ever being arrested, ever being incarcerated, or being incarcerated if you get arrested, which is kind of a measure of severity. Okay, so lead offending. There is so much research at the individual level showing that early childhood exposure to lead increases crime. Adolescents that were exposed to lead when they were young children are twice as likely to be delinquent. Twice as likely to be juvenile delinquents. environmental contaminant that predicts crime. Of all the things you can get exposed to in the environment, non-social, like physical things, right? Like different chemicals you can get exposed to, the only environmental contaminant that is consistently related to criminal offending is lead, because it fucks up your brain. Now, studies have started looking at it at the aggregate level. On average, our neighborhoods where more people were exposed to lead, more likely to have high crime rates. Here's one study. You'll notice one of the authors there, not the first author, but like the fifth author, Richard Rosenfeld, he's dead now. He's one of the major crime trend analysts, and he wrote one of the things you're supposed to read, right? This is the abstract from this study, which in a lot of places, unless you really want to do research on your own, the abstract gives you mostly what you need, right? This is what they found. This is the key finding. Now, although an abstract will give you mostly what you need, the problem with science is that we like to write in ways that people have no fucking idea what we're talking about. So, greater lead exposure at the census tract level. What the hell is a census tract? That's a measure of neighborhoods. It ain't perfect, but it is a geographic measure used by the U.S. Census, which is small enough that scientists generally consider it to be a neighborhood. Neighborhood level area, right? At the census tract level, it's associated with increased violent, nonviolent, and total crime. In addition, we examined where there were non-additive effects. That simply means they wanted to know whether or not aggregate lead exposure mattered more in poor areas than rich areas. They were looking for heterogeneity in effects, and they didn't find it. Overall, average lead exposure increased crime in well-off areas and in poor areas. Independent of neighborhood socioeconomic status, average exposure to lead made people more criminal. Right? That's what the study basically suggests. Now, this is a huge study. Now, what I mean by huge study is they followed 800,000 children. That's about 800 times bigger than most studies, right? This is a huge study. Longitudinal, looking at children's life outcomes. This is what they found. We find that even a low exposure affects long-run outcomes, that boys are more affected, and that changes in non-cognitive skills explain a sizable share of the impact on crime and human capital. Which probably leads to those of you paying attention to the question, what are non-cognitive skills? I thought you said IQ was the mechanism. It sort of is. In this situation, I wouldn't call these non-cognitive. It's just self-control, the ability to regulate your emotions. It's how they measure non-cognitive skills. Essentially, your higher order cognitive ability. Could lead explain crime trends? Could changes in exposure to lead explain how crime has changed? So, let me show you a bunch of graphs. Two of the graphs are different than the other one. One of them is not about crime at all. The first graph is about lead exposure, lag. Remember, the word lag means impact. So lead exposure 20 years ago compared to something now. Here are the trends between gas lead exposure and then about 20 years later, teen pregnancies. So the blue line is the lead exposure trend and the brown line is teen pregnancies. And the gap here is around 20 years, right? Y'all may not know it, but pregnancies for teenage women, girls, have dropped substantially. People would anticipate the opposite, but they're really low now compared to what they used to be. This is the crime one. This is violent. So the blue line is exposure to lead, and the brown line on the bottom graph is violent offenses per 100,000 people. That's police data. Now, we're only seeing one part of the story here, right? I already told you there are multiple peaks. This is showing you largely gas lead, right? Remember when we looked at the exposure to lead a couple slides ago? There were two peaks, because first people were exposed to paint lead and the dust from it, and then people were exposed to gas lead after they stopped using lead in paint. So if that's the case, if lead is a cause of crime, well, if we go back to the paint time period, we ought to see a similar graph. So this is not yet getting back to the paint period, but just juxtaposing gasoline lead against violent crime with about a 20-year lag. Showing you that the graph on the right, also if you have it from a different article with slightly different lag structure, looks very similar. And then this is when you add paint and go all the way back to the 1800s. Now, I don't study this, and I have zero stake in whether it's right or wrong, but the people who do study it think that changes in lead might explain 90% of the crime drop. They think lead and its cognitive and social effects may be one of the driving factors of crime trends in the United States and in other countries. Here you have different countries. The top left one is the USA. The one on the right is France, Italy, West Germany, and Australia. And you have lead juxtaposed against the index crime rate, those 8 offenses, right? So the people who study this think it might be the primary explanation, up to 90%. Not all criminologists agree, but the number of criminologists who agree has increased. Even Eric Baumer, who had an article that literally just came out trying to explain crime rates during protests, it's online verse right now, has put more faith in this and tried to figure out a way to study it better. Some economists also agree. It's still a fringe explanation because it's not the mainly endorsed one, but it's not baseless. Right? You would look at it and go, this is stupid. There's a lot of evidence that suggests lead, maybe it didn't explain 90%, but probably explains something. It seems kind of important. Okay. Now we're going to do something different. And it's going to be a little crazy. Because we're going to do something wild because most people don't know it. And right now we've been talking about the crime drop from the 90s. And I really like this classroom because it's cool and all, but I miss the fucking whiteboard. Because normally I would draw something. So all of the focus has been narrowly, like spotlight, on 1980 to now. All scientists have studied that. And The broader story is a huge story about the nature of humanity more broadly and changes in human society more broadly. And I'm going to see, hopefully this works. Let's see. So, I'm going to give you another alternative explanation. This alternative explanation for crime rates basically suggests you don't have to explain the post-1990s crime drop. That is the default. Crime is going to keep going down. When COVID happened, and I was here with the students, and crime started going up in like late 2020 and 21, I told them, I said, listen, I could be wrong, but based on what I'm going to show you, my strong expectation is that by 2023, regardless of what the government does, crime's going to start going back down, and it will keep going back down in the years after that. And thus far, we've been right. And that expectation, that prediction, is based on this. Now, this argument I'm going to give you is laid out by Steven Pinker, who's a great writer. He's a psychologist at Harvard University. He wrote what is one of my 3 favorite nonfiction books ever written, and it's about the size of a brick. It's like 800, 900 pages long, called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And then he wrote a shorter, more accessible book. It's still like 500 pages long, called Enlightenment Now. Enlightenment Now is full of graphs. Graphs that would make people go, no fucking way. Right? And it basically suggests that every indicator of human society has gotten better over the last 100 to 200 years. Right? Now, hopefully this works. If it doesn't, I'm going to have to pull up the thing independently and show you. But I want to foreshadow this to you because at the beginning of this is a long thing. It's going to take 2 classes to go through it. In my life as an academic, this is the thing I think is the coolest. I think it's absolutely cool, and I think it explains stuff that a lot of people spotlight on and miss. But in order to go where we're going to go, I just want to try to show you a little bit of evidence and hopefully, and then explain it why this is so important. Let's see if this works. So if this graph works, and if it doesn't, I'm going to pull it up and show it to you differently. If this works, when I click the button, this is going to start moving. And what's going to happen is, every one of the dots is a country. And then up there where it says year, the year is going to change. It's going to go from 1900 all the way up to about now. Above year, there's going to be something bad, some horrible thing, or something good. Right now, this is child mortality. So this is the percent of kids who die, right? And that's bad. We don't like that. And you're going to see how it changes in every country across time. Please work. Okay. I also checked this before I came in today because I really wanted it to work. But obviously, shit happens. This is life expectancy. This is gross domestic product. That is the wealth of nations. This is women's education. This is basic water source access. That is access to clean water. This is basic sanitation. Places to put poop. I'm going to do it one more time. It's a point bears emphasizing. And I'll show you other graphs as we go. I wish this thing would go away. That was child mortality. This is life expectancy. Gross domestic product or wealth. Women's education. Water access. has gotten better over the last 100, 200, sometimes 500 years. That there is a profound long-term trend toward improvement. Now, sometimes there are periodic setbacks, but unless something keeps those conditions stable, things fall back to the long default trend of getting better. So in the case of crime, the argument is that human violence is declining and will continue to decline. Periodically, something will happen. Crack cocaine will be invented. There will be a year or two with high crime. Then it will go back. Periodically, something will happen. There will be a pandemic, or there will be protests and delegitimation, and then after a couple of years, it will go back. The long-term trend is down in crime. What we have to explain is not the downward trend, but the periodic upticks. Crack cocaine, right? The protests and the COVID pandemic, because the long-term trend is down. Now, to understand the long-term downward trend in crime and the long-term upward increase in everything good, we got to do something crazy. What I think is really cool. We have to start a long time ago. Because what's going on now, and what's going to keep going on during your lifetime, unless some crazy shit happens, like Yellowstone erupts, or we get a nuclear war, what's going on is the end result of 3 stages of human existence. And they all depend on the previous one. So if I had a whiteboard, I would draw each of these stages. They're on the test. And you can't get them from anything else except the lecture. Unless you go out and get the book or ask, AI about it. Not in any readings. There are 3 stages. The 3 stages beginning with the pacification process. The next stage is the civilizing process. I'll repeat all of these. And the last stage, the one we're in right now, is called the humanitarian revolution. The first stage, the pacification process. The second stage, the civilizing process. And the third stage is called the humanitarian revolution. Now, the humanitarian revolution, we're going to talk about next time. It takes a lot to go over. It's the one we're in right now. And that humanitarian revolution began, hence the name of the book at the top, during the European Enlightenment. It started about 1700, the late 1700s. And it has been continuing since. That's the last stage. And only exists because of the first 2 stages, which we're going to talk about today. Or begin to talk about today. The first stage is the pacification process. And it's necessary to explain all the other stages. The pacification process. All right, here's the crazy part. The pacification process began roughly 5,000 years ago. That is about 3000 BC. And it continued till about 1000 AD. And it involved, as the booklet up here says, the shift from non-state to state societies. From the anarchy of hunter-gatherer groups to the first agricultural civilizations. This is on the test. The shift from the anarchy of hunter-gatherer societies to the first agricultural civilizations, the first states where you had some form of government with a monopoly on violence. The first agricultural civilizations began about 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago, and continued to about 1000 AD. To about the 11th century. Alright, now when I say something like, so we're going to explain why the shift from non-state to state is so important. Let me just say this part here. The evidence suggests, and I'm going to show you graphs, that living in a state that is in a civilization with a government reduces your probability of dying by violence fivefold. That you are 5 times less likely to die by violence if you live in a state that is a civilization with a government with a monopoly on violence, like police, than if you live in a tribe. About 5 times less likely to die by violence. Now, many of us, when we think of hunter-gatherer society, we think peace. We think little tribes, and we think they're peaceful and all that. How would we know what it was like back then? How would we know whether or not hunter-gatherer societies in 3000 BC were peaceful? Well, the answer is we find skeletons. And you can tell when people died with their head bashed in. This particular skeleton is famous. Murder truck man died 5,200 years ago. He had his head beaten in a ball, right? In Europe. We have a good sense. So this is an example of one of the studies. A review of 11 anthropological studies looking at skeleton, reporting cause of death, showed that violence led to about 30% of adult deaths. Imagine that. Imagine if 30% of the obituaries in the newspaper, or 30% of the funerals that you went to were because somebody murdered somebody, right? Violence led to about 30% of adult deaths. And down here you can see foreshadowing that revenge raids killed more people than original grievances. In one of the last lectures, if we get to it of the semester, I'm going to give you an actual anthropological account of a revenge raid where they cut off women's vaginas and hung them on a thing, right? To get back at something that had happened before. They were fucking gruesome. We know from anthropological evidence that about 65 to 75% of hunter-gatherer groups are at war at least every 2 years. The vast majority, 65 to 75%, go to war at least every 2 years. Hence the title, Anarchy of Hunter-Gatherer Societies. Now, to understand why you have so much violence in non-state society, in non-civilization with government, in hunter-gatherer society, we're going to have to turn to Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called The Leviathan, the big famous guy hundreds of years ago. And in his book, The Leviathan, he argued crudely, basically, that there are 3 sources of violence. Roughly speaking, three sources of violence, 3 motives for violence, roughly speaking. According to Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan, the first source of violence was competition. Competition. In the situation of competition, people attack other people for gain, to make them masters of other people's property, of their money, of their women. They attack other people for personal gain. Fewer and fewer people are reading, but for whatever reason I'm odd, and about 3 years ago I got on a reading kick, and I've been reading everything I can get my hands on. And one of the things I read, which I had watched the movie a long time ago, which is sort of about it, is the Iliad. And the movie that's around the Iliad is Troy with Brad Pitt in it, and it's a great movie. He kills this big-ass monster at the beginning of it with a spear. Not a monster, but like a 7-foot-tall dude. Great, right? And then he screams, "Is there anyone else?" And that's also where the quote comes, that's where no one will remember your name. and bloody days in battle, fighting other men for their women. That's competition. That's the motive of violence, of attacking other people for gain. By the way, if you do read the Iliad or the Odyssey, if you're anything like me and you may be different, this is the right translation. I tried to read the Robert Fagles translation, which they assign in a lot of English classes, and I hated it. But Emily Wilson translated both. Her Iliad came out just like a year or two ago, and her Odyssey came out from that, and it is phenomenal. It's so much better. And I wouldn't imagine, some of y'all might read it because Christopher Nolan's movie, The Odyssey, is coming out next summer, right? Or next fall with Matt Damon. That's going to be incredible. Okay, the next source of violence, the next motive for violence after competition is, in the old language, diffidence. Diffidence. Somebody always asks me how to spell it, and I say, I don't know. I can guess. It's written down over there. It's like Diffidence. I don't know. Diffidence. Diffidence is the word they used back in the day in the 16, 15, 1700s for fear. What it means is attacking other people so they don't attack you. Preemptively attacking them. Preemptively attacking them. Diffidence. Now the third source of violence, we had competition, Achilles. Then we had diffidence. And the third source of violence, according to Hobbes, right? Thomas Hobbes, is glory, which just means reputation. You attack people to maintain a reputation. To maintain a reputation. What kind of reputation? A reputation as a hard ass. A reputation that would deter other people. You attack someone over any sign of insult, bad look, mean look, some kind of insult to show people you're not to be messed with. The idea is that violence over glory, violence for a reputation, is designed to deter other people from attacking you by saying that you are tough. Any sign of disrespect leads to violence. Competition, diffidence, glory. Now, the key point is that the shift from a non-state society acts on all three of these via a Leviathan effect. The shift to a state society acts on all three of those via Leviathan effects. When you have a state government, a centralized authority with a monopoly on violence, it reduces the incentive to attack people for gain. If you attack me, you get arrested. You get executed. That when you have a state government with a monopoly on violence, it reduces the incentive for competition to attack for gain. It reduces the incentive to attack other people, to make yourself masters of their property and their women and their land and their money. It reduces the incentive for competition. If you reduce people's incentive for competition and they stop attacking people, then you reduce diffidence. People are less afraid. You have less violence that's preemptive. You have less violence that's preemptive. to attack the young woman of color. And she's not diffident because she knows if the dude hits her, he's going to get arrested. The Leviathan reduces the incentive to attack for gain and thus reduces diffidence. It also obviates, that means reduces, everybody's need to maintain a reputation as tough. It reduces the incentive to attack for glory. You don't need a reputation as tough to deter people. You don't need to maintain a hair trigger so that people think that you're tough, because you have a monopoly on violence in a civilization state. So the basic finding from research on this is that the single most consistent reducer of violence known to humankind is a civilization, is a government, and it reduces your probability of dying from violence fivefold. Here's one graph. This shows the rate of death in warfare in non-state and state societies, right? Up there you have the non-states in different time periods and locations, and there you have the states. The most consistent reducer of violence known to humankind is a state, a government with a monopoly on violence. This is another graph that shows you the homicide rates in the least violent non-state society, that is the nicest non-state society, juxtaposed against state societies. The least violent non-state societies juxtaposed against state societies. So, what we have thus far, the first major, for our intents and purposes, period of human existence where we began this march of progress, began about 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago, when hunter-gatherer societies, which were always fighting, began to form into the first agricultural civilizations, the first states, where there was a government with a monopoly on violence. And that dramatically made them safer. And it set the preconditions for the second stage, the civilizing process, which began in about the 11th century and continued to approximately the 1700s. A civilizing process. It is an economic revolution that led to a cultural revolution. Civilizing process. Beginning in about the 11th century, that's about 1000 AD, continuing to about the 1700s. So to understand the civilizing process, we've got to start with some economic concepts. You learn about this in the discussion of game theory. This is like the most intro game theory thing you could get, right? Nowadays, poker players know more about game theory than science. Game optimal play. Game theory optimal play. We're going to talk about a zero-sum game versus a positive-sum game. In a zero-sum game, the people playing can only get more by taking away from somebody else. The people playing can only gain more by taking away what someone else has. Each player can only benefit themselves at the expense of another player. Can only get more by taking away what another player has. A classic way to illustrate a zero-sum game is a pie, which for most people nobody cares. Today's my mom's birthday, we're going to have a cake when we get home. Very, very straightforward. Because they get fucking mad if somebody's slice is bigger than theirs. When you have a pie or a cake, you can only get a bigger slice if other people get a smaller slice. And the amount of pie or cake is finite, and so the amount you get is inversely related to what other people get. That is a zero-sum game. A positive-sum game is different. The players have choices that can benefit them all simultaneously. I can get richer while you also get richer. We have choices where we all simultaneously benefit each other. I can get richer without hurting you, without taking stuff away from you. We can get richer together. That's a positive sum game. So these two concepts are important because in the first agricultural civilization, in the beginning civilization after the shift to state society around 11th century, 12th century, the economic basis in society was zero sum. It was land. The ticket to power and wealth was invading somebody else and taking what they had. You had a land-based economy. That's why I got this feudal pyramid of power with land, 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 land. The heart of the economy was land, which is one thing you can't make more of. It's a zero-sum game. Wealth, power, prestige, dependent on taking from other people. Over the course of the civilizing process, as we're going to see on the next slide, that shifted. There was an economic revolution that shifted from a land-based economy to one based on trading and exchanges. To a positive sum economy based on exchange. Yep, a positive sum economy based on exchange, on trading. On exchange, on trading. Now we're under zero sum, positive sum. The last bullet point come in and says the trading of blank. What goes in that blank is the word surpluses. The trading of surpluses. When you have more of something than you need. The trading of surpluses. When you have more of something than you need. Now, before going on, let's think about how the positive sum game, it changes the society in a lot of ways. The most straightforward way is it changes the incentives for survival. When you are engaged in a positive sum game, when you're engaged in an exchange relationship with someone else, they are now worth more to you alive than dead. Or as one scholar put it, if the farmer goes to war with the baker, he henceforth has to bake his own bread. When you're in an exchange relationship, the incentives for violence go down because your trading partner now is worth more to you alive than dead. If you attack them, you have to bake your own bread, milk your own cows, sew your own clothes, shoe your own horses. Alright, positive sum games generally involve the trading of surpluses, which means a prerequisite is that there's a division of labor. You go do something really efficiently, I go do something else really efficiently, and then we trade our surplus. You go become a farmer and specialize in growing, I go become a baker and specialize in cooking, we exchange. I go become someone who sews clothes, you go become a blacksmith, we exchange. A precondition for surpluses is a division of labor and specialization. So the basic argument is that when you have a Leviathan, it began with a land-based economy which was zero-sum, where the incentives were violence, to attack other people for land. But over time, you had a more complex division of labor, people accumulated surpluses, they began to trade them, reducing the incentives for violence. And you had a different kind of economy. The term that people use for a trading-based economy is gentle commerce. Gentle commerce. Commerce meaning exchange, trading. Gentle means you don't have incentives to attack. Gentle commerce. Now imagine that you found somebody in this class who's a good student, that you trust. And they take notes, and you take notes, and y'all exchange them. But one day, that student you're exchanging notes with sleeps with your boyfriend. Or, they don't show up to class, and when you say something, they call you a bunch of names. Tell you shut the fuck up. If you're going to maintain a trading relationship, you have to learn manners, self-control, how to anticipate what other people want. Trading in a long-term situation requires the development of social etiquette. Manners, self-control, planning, foresight. If you're supposed to trade with me when you bake cookies and you eat them all one night watching TV, that's not cool. I want my cookies. But the argument is that as gentle commerce emerged, people began to develop psychological skills necessary to maintain trading relationships. Self-control, manners, etiquette, planning, role-taking. They developed psychological tools that then changed the culture. I'm imagining that y'all have heard the word courtesy. Right? That word comes because when they shifted from a land-based economy to a commerce-based economy, the ticket to fame and prestige and money was taking your ass to a king's court and trading there. And they developed manuals for courtly manners, the manners that were appropriate in the king's court. Those courtly manners, where to put your snot, not to wipe your butt in certain ways, those courtly manners then trickle down. Right? The manners appropriate for exchange and trading, the skills necessary to do it, trickle down. This is the basic argument in the civilizing process. You had the division of labor. It led people to accumulate surpluses. They began to exchange, and that led to cultural change and the development of psychological tools necessary for interpersonal relationships. None of this could happen without the Leviathan, the big tent of the Leviathan, without a state that has a monopoly on violence, that keeps people from attacking you and taking your cookies. So I'm going to show you the graphs here, and we're going to go over this stuff, but I want to show you two things, and then we're going to go back and do the other stuff. This is the percentage of deaths of English male aristocrats from violence from 1330 to 1829. Aristocrats means wealthy people. That means well-off people. This is the percentage of well-off English people who died from violence from 1300s to 1800s. You can see it just tanked. Just tanked as the economy shifted from land-based to general commerce. This is the overall homicide rates in 5-year